All right, well, welcome to this is part 7 of our Galatians study, and we've had 6 sessions so far and gone through the first 3 chapters so far of Paul's letter to the 4 churches in Galatia. So we pick up here in chapter 4, and Paul has just finished up at the end of chapter 3 explaining that there's no difference positionally in the believer. There's no male, no female, no Greek, no Jew, no slave, no free. We're all positionally the same in Christ. And so he kind of piggybacks onto that into the beginning of chapter 4. And we'll look at today Galatians 4 1 through 9 and dig into some. There's really some cool things here theologically that we'll look at. So let's dig into the text and we'll kind of move along into some discussion. So Galatians 4 1 through 9, this is out of the English Standard Version. And Paul writes, I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything, but he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved by the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world? Whose slaves you want to be once more? Paul asks. So that's Galatians 4 1 through 9. And there's some really neat things Paul's explaining here. Some things we might miss on just a quick glance reading of this text. So let's look at a few of these things. Keys to the text. First of all, in verses 1 to 2, Paul continues his analogy of our being under a guardian. And he's explaining that the law was that guardian. And here he relates it to being a child who is still under guardianship and not yet able to experience the fullness of what his father owns. So here the word child refers specifically to an infant who is too young to talk and is both spiritually and intellectually immature. And then we see in verse 3 this phrase, elementary principles of the world. And Paul says in the same way when you were children, you were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. So here, this phrase, elementary principles, refers to the basics of the world, like the letters of the alphabet or the number system, things that we all had to learn as children before we were able to function really in any kind of sort of way. And here Paul uses this analogy to explain that the basic Jewish and Gentile religious systems were centered on elementary man-made ideas and rituals and not on divine principles such as faith in Jesus Christ. Then in verses 4 and 5, we notice this idea that we are heirs. Paul says we're heirs to God's promise, the promise made to Abraham because of faith in Christ. And as a result, he says we've been adopted as the sons and daughters of God. Now, Paul vividly uses this image of adoption, and he uses it to explain that believers are spiritually brought into God's family from their natural place in another world, which is the world of sin that we're born into. And this family is opposed. This world system family that we're born into is opposed to God. So we're born into the world where we have a fallen, sinful nature. We've talked about that before. And then God adopts us and allows us to become part of his family. And as adopted sons and daughters, we now receive the full blessings or the full rights that a family member would have, primarily speaking about the rights that his son Jesus has. So, in an adoption kind of setting, just quickly, the person adopted is obviously from a different family first off, and they're from maybe even a different background or culture possibly, and oftentimes that's the case. But then they're adopted into this new family, and when they're adopted, and that's official, they then have all of the rights that that family has. They have, what the family has is now theirs, and they have rights to that. So Paul's using this analogy when we're non-believers, before we're saved, before we have redemption in Christ, we're part of the world, and that's our natural setting. And then God adopts us into His family, and we become new now in that way. We have all the rights and blessings that Jesus has, basically. So Paul's explaining that in really a neat way using this adoption analogy. So just as a side note here, it's important to understand this term heir. And Paul says there in verse 1, he talks about being an heir. And we see this again in verse 6. And then we also see it back in chapter 3 of Galatians. And it's important to understand within the context here of the first century culture that Paul's writing to, this term, this idea of an heir would be understood by everyone who read it. It was super important in that time, and it referred to someone who was entitled to receive the benefits of everything that their father owned. So if you were an heir, the firstborn generally would be the heir. You would then be entitled to everything the father owned upon his death. So now in our case, if we're heirs, as Christians, we are then promised to receive everything that God has to offer through Christ. So that's a huge symbolism there that Paul is using, this idea of being an heir, being adopted. And it's something that would definitely have been understood fully by the people he was writing to there in the first century in those churches in Galatia. So really cool stuff there. Then in verses 8 and 9, Paul explains the contrast between knowing God and not knowing Him. And he uses this phrase, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. Here he refers to anything that someone worships in the place of the one true God. In the context of Paul's letter to the Galatians, it's referring to the many pagan gods that they were worshiping in that culture at the time. But when it's applied to our modern context, it could refer to anything that we place our trust or our comfort in for acceptance or for gain, such as money or fame or social acceptance or influence. Could be even things like food or sports or shopping. Anything we place our trust in to provide us comfort, apart from God, would be applicable to what Paul's talking about here in verses 8 and 9. And then in verse 9, Paul writes, but now that you have come to know God, or rather, he says, to be known by God. And that phrase is, I don't know, sometimes we skip over, or we don't grasp maybe sometimes what Paul's getting at. And Paul is super heavy theologically on what he's writing. It's not, he writes in sometimes in symbols, but he's got usually a theological theme that he's trying to teach the first century church, and obviously we receive that as well. So he says here in verse 9, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God. And here Paul's theology really comes to the surface as he explains that we can only know God because He first knew us. We choose Christ only because He first chose us, and we see that in John 6:44 or John 15:16. And we love Him only because He first loved us, and we see that in 1 John 4:19. So that's really something to grab a hold of and understand that we're known by God. We don't just know Him or know about Him, or God knows us in an intimate way, and that's super important. So let's look quickly at some discussion, reflection now out of this section. And the first one is in verses 4 to 6, Paul lays out this illustration of adoption and becoming an heir. We talked a little bit about that idea of being an heir. And here he explains that we were once slaves and were then adopted by God. And in becoming adopted, we enjoy all the promises that are reserved for a relationship of that father-son, father-daughter relationship. As a result, we need not go through life defeated, but with confidence and boldness, rather, because our Father owns everything and treats us as if we had done everything that Christ has done. So the question there in that context is, why do we often fail to embrace our position with God as heirs to His promises? Why do we easily believe in the blessings of our future life? You know, we're going to go to heaven. We believe in Jesus. We're going to go to heaven. We have no problem believing in that part, but we fail to embrace our current life with Him with the same confidence. So if you would, on our Facebook page, share a struggle or circumstance that you have or that you've had where you feel defeated and forget your position with God as an heir. So that's the first one. The second one is in verse 8, Paul confronts the issue of placing other gods or idols in God's place. Today we are constantly faced with a world system which tries to sell us on every idea that that's out there, accumulating wealth, approval, comfort, excitement, acceptance on Facebook. You know, how many likes can you get on your post and all that, and that supposedly will lead to a fulfilled life. The world tries to tell us that, but the truth is, anything that we come to depend on, anything that we worship, we will become enslaved by eventually. And this is especially dangerous in the area of other world religions, where people convince themselves or become convinced that God will accept them through some means other than faith in Jesus Christ. And there's a term for that called universalism, where all paths kind of come and lead to God, and that's definitely not what the Bible teaches. So with that in mind, the question would be, what things are you most in danger of worshiping or depending on in place of God? Give some examples of some things maybe you struggle with that you put your comfort and trust into apart from God. And then how would you explain to someone who is searching for God that He is not centrally interested in their prosperity or their worldly comfort or their talent or their physical appearance or fulfillment, etc., but He's more interested in who they are in relation to Him. And that's obviously in a spiritual sense, primarily there. So that's the question there, number 2. And then finally, the third one says in verse 9, we get a dose of Paul's theology when he proclaims that now that you have chosen to, that now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, and he's really just kind of shifting gears, you know. Now that he first says, well, now that you've come to know God, or actually he's saying, but rather than that, it's actually the opposite. God knows you. So what makes a person a Christian is not so much our knowing of God. You know, we can sit in church or watch, a TV preacher or whatever it might be and learn about God, learn things about the Bible or about Jesus, but what really makes us a Christian is when God knows us. And that phrase "to know" here refers to much more than some basic awareness. It refers to a personal relationship that is intimate in nature. So God knowing us doesn't mean that He knows about us. He created us, kind of. He knows we're there. It's He knows us in the context of a personal, intimate relationship. So the question there, the third question is, if God knows us and we know Him, why do we act so insecure in many areas of life? This insecurity often leads us to place idols or things that we hope to control or depend on in God's place. How can we focus more on the truth that if we have faith in Christ, God already knows us and accepts us as heirs to all that He has. He's adopted us into His family, and then we share in all that He has. So give an example of when you feel secure in your place with God. And then maybe an example, actually, we already talked about an example of where maybe you place other things in God's place for comfort or for control. But give an example in this last question of when you feel secure in your place with God. So that's the three questions there. Galatians 4, verses 1 to 9. Hopefully, you guys will have time to take a look at this and think about some of the great theological themes that Paul's covering here. This idea of being an heir, being adopted, and that kind of thing. And so I'm looking forward to your comments and your thoughts on this, and then we will pick it up again next time with the second half of chapter 4. Until then, you guys have a great week, and I will see you soon.